welcome again to everybody. This is actually the last seminar for this term. And gosh, what a long, heavy term it's been. I think a lot of us will be very pleased to get to the end of that. But we've also got something interesting and exciting this evening, because we're very lucky to get Professor Elke Winter to present a talk to us. I'll just say a few words about Elke first. She's a professor at the School of Sociological and Anthropological Studies and Director of Research in the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Citizenship and Minorities at the University of Ottawa. Her research examines the relationship between boundary construction, material inequalities, and pluralist inclusion in ethnically diverse societies. She won the Canadian Sociology Association's John Porter Tradition of Excellence Award for her book, Us, Them and Others, Pluralism and National Identity in Diverse Societies. And she recently co-edited When States Take Rights Back, Citizenship, Revocation, and Its Discontents, and is currently co-editing a special issue on civic integration in Canada and France. In the spring of next year, 2021, she will return to Harvard University as a visiting professor for sociology and Canadian studies, where she would have been this year, but we all know what happened. So thank you very much for agreeing to give us a presentation. And the title of your talk, Elke, is Multicultural Citizenship for the Highly Skilled, ? Naturalization, Human Capital, and the Boundaries of Belonging in Canada's Middle Class Nation Building. So thanks, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Tariq. This is it's an honor to, thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to speak here. And I know that I am in this series, and I know that I'm the one probably last presentation between you and the holidays. And I so doubly or twice appreciate that you've taken the time to be here. I'll see if I can share my screen, which I think we just tried that and I could. Let's see, here we go. And play from start. There we go. Okay, good. So this paper, well, let me just see, because I need to move my wrong here, but I need to move you out of the way because right, there we go. So this paper is based on a paper that was, or the talk is based actually on a paper that was just published in Ethnicities, and I think Thomas will be providing the URL in the chat. And it is part of a special issue on naturalization policies, citizenship regimes, and the regulation of belonging in anxious society, which is co-edited by Leah Bassel, Pierre Montfort, David Bodrum, and Kamran Khan. And I really owe a lot of thanks to these editors for comments. Obviously, the errors are entirely mine. The paper that I'm going to present looks at the naturalization of the highly skilled immigrants in Canada, and it is flanked by a twin paper. Oh, no, I need to push this, sorry. A twin paper that will be is also forthcoming in the French Revue Européenne d'Immigration Internationale, and that is published with Delphine Nakache, Jennifer Stone, and myself. And there we actually look at the other part of the equation. We actually look at those who do not have difficulty in accessing Canada's Canadian citizenship, namely immigrants from the family class and refugees. And in both papers, what we actually do is we ask, and that's the question that that drives this paper, is what happens to citizenship in a multicultural country when naturalization rules and procedures become highly econocentric. On the one hand, we have, that's what we see, increasingly the facilitation of citizenship for those with highly valued skills and human capital. and to a certain extent, so far that we can say talent trumps racialization. On the other hand, rendering access to citizenship increasingly, is rendered increasingly difficult for vulnerable immigrant populations, such as women, disabled, with trauma or difficult migration experiences, refugees, and those with low education or skills that it's less valuable. So here, when we have also these individuals stemming mostly from the global south, so we have, if you want, a racialized population also as a kind of underclass. That's what the paper tries to investigate. Canada, roughly put, has an intake, and I see from many of the, or at least from the names that are visible to me, so that I should acknowledge that people in the room who have done extensive research on that, so I look forward to the discussion. But just for those who are not as familiar with Canada, a brief overview. If you want, you have an intake of about 1% of its population in permanent residence, so immigrants that are then also on the path to citizenship. Currently, we have roughly 2/3 of Canada's population growth stems through immigration, and it's expected to be 100% in 2037. Predominantly, those immigrants come from Asia, roughly 60%, including the Middle East, and Africa, roughly 13 or 14%. So we do have, as intake, a racialized population. Then again, maybe we just roughly speaking, 60% come through the economic class, so skilled and highly skilled immigrants, 25 through as families, and then roughly 15 or 10 to 15 through as refugees or humanitarian class. What prompted this paper in particular, let's see if I can push the right button here, was that that while Canada has still a fairly high citizenship pass rate, it did fall in recent years. It fell particularly under the Harper conservative regimes, but it wasn't brought up by the Liberals. So if you see, look at something like a citizenship pass rate is at 86%, you would say, well, you know, what's the big deal? What is the big deal is that it is extremely uneven. If you look at the numbers, you have a pass rate of about, below 50% for women born in Afghanistan, for example, and you have citizenship test pass rates above 95% for men admitted, of regardless which ethnicity admitted under the skilled worker program. So you do see actually a second kind of a model that was a selection model that is working under the so-called point system for immigration that is now increasingly applied also through to citizenship tests. So low rates for people with secondary or less education, which are people who are admitted as refugees, having no knowledge in the official language. One of the two official languages, English or French at landing, will decrease your citizenship pass rate, or whether you're born in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Eritrea, or Ethiopia. Women in all categories fare lower than men. So that's the notion of what I call uneven naturalization. Quickly towards what we used in terms of looking at the theoretical approach that was used for the study. Citizenship as social closure was probably first and most famously introduced by Roger Studebaker in 1992 in his where he looked at Germany and France and concluded that national paths or kinds of conceptions of nationhood would then also which were either more civic or more ethnic, would then also affect citizenship regimes. This was rephrased by Christian Jobke, who would argue, well, citizenship as closure, rules as closures always include some form of de-ethnicization and re-ethnicization, meaning the two actually go together. It doesn't, it's not two poles, but it's actually a constant making of rules which involve both kind of identitarian functions based on how the nation presents itself, as well as civic elements that are pushing towards universalism. Similarly, the notion of the economy was, I think, most importantly brought in by James Holyfield in that idea of the liberal paradox. Here too, we have the idea that there's the kind of a binary between an economic side of migration that the states wanting immigrants that is pushing towards openness, whereas the more the identitarian part of nation building pushes towards closure. So again, you have this idea of the nation being selectively open and closed. Now, maybe what I want to argue here in this paper, and I've done so before with Jennifer Elric in another paper, is really that there is no binary between the economic and the cultural dimensions of social closure. Actually, they are both if you want, and pardon my naturalistic language here, but they are actually the DNA of nation building. In this sense, you have immigration as a kind of first layer of social closure. So in an interest and ideas driven, and in Canada, we've seen a kind of this change from the model of national preference to family class to now increasingly economic selection since the 1990s, should add. And then naturalization, so becoming access to citizenship as a kind of second or layer of national closure, namely usually after 4 years and the minimal kind of conditions for it were living and working in the society, no criminal convictions, and then after roughly 4, it changed a bit from government to government, but roughly after 4 years of lawful residence, people were able to take up the citizenship application process. Now, here it's what we argue is what we see is that we see a gentrification of citizenship, and the way I'd like to or describe this more closely in the paper is really that nation building from the very beginning has not just been an ethnic or civic or kind of project, but it was, after all, mostly a middle class project. So the Kultur in German, or education, which is it's really the bourgeois kind of self-definition by excellence, which argues against the excellence of birth. And in today's kind of parlance, we have human capital is the way that Kultur or Bildung is defined, and it defines this access to citizenship. Now, roughly, what we did in this, and I jump over this more quickly. You have the paper where you can read more of that. What I did with a couple of students, we looked at roughly 40 interviews that lasted 1.5 hours with recently naturalized citizens. We did this in the Ottawa-Gatineau region, which is where you see Ottawa. My home university is, and we looked at both also the Quebec side, the French-speaking side, and Ottawa. And something else I should just put in, we wanted to really know what are the hurdles that immigrants come up to as they're going through the application process. So after 4 years, more or less, of lawful residence in Canada, they file an application. Then they, which demands lots of documents, and kind of from Canada, but also from home countries. Then they are provided with the citizenship test guide, which is at this point still the same, but it is hopefully revised soon, and will sit a test. After the test, the third step is the ceremony, where they then also take a citizenship oath. We asked, prompted the kind of citizens, the newly citizens, and which we recruited through Snowball, but also by attending citizenship conferences, but also test ceremonies, but also through a call with the Center for Citizenship, who have an email list. And when we coded, we did this really inductively, trying to just see what are the barriers, the boundaries that come up, and we divided between bright and broad. I will jump over that part mostly here because I really want to have a discussion with you. And as I said, it can be the details can be found in the paper. But what was in a way striking, well, maybe not if you look at the citizenship pass rates, but what was striking if you compare this, puts Canada in comparison with other countries, particularly UK, but also the Netherlands, was that mostly, and we asked, so these citizens, how they found the hurdles are, and most of what they felt is that the boundaries were both. They were mostly broad, so they felt that they had fairly easy access, and they were mostly, that is something that we actually looked at, defined is that they were based on human capital. What do I mean by human capital? So, for example, you had problems with or obtaining citizen application forms and instruction online. You needed to have a certain education in order to get this. Communicating in writing with agents in Canada and back home for obtaining documents, certificates, copies of birthright or birth or marriage certificates, fingerprints, tax form, and so on. Filing forms and counting presences and absences in Canada, you have to be a resident for four full years. So you need to kind of count out which times you have been abroad. Some people had difficulties and their files were rejected. Others said, no, I did an Excel sheet from the very beginning. I knew this was coming up. I managed this. Assembling all relevant documents. Obtaining information from the ministry, writing language tests, studying the citizenship test, which is about a 60-page document. Sitting knowledge test. Again, sitting, a test is not something that comes easily if you've never sit a test or if you barely know how to write in your own language. Indicating, for example, to the ministry a scheduling conflict. You were scheduled to sit the test, but you're not in the country at that moment for work, for private reasons whatsoever. You need to communicate with the ministry. And then bringing also the correct forms and documents to the test and the ceremonies. These were, compared to other boundaries, the most important ones. The other boundaries, just to mention them because you have those charts here. So those that matter the least is what we call civic liberal boundaries. This is when our interviewees told us, well, yes, this is test, this is normal, it's nothing. We realize that this is a step or a hurdle, but there's a test, this is normal, the average kind of, it's the same for everyone. It is just something that a civic kind of immigrant receiving democracy does. So no big deal. Cultural communitarian boundaries were those where actually immigrants felt that they were handicapped because of their race, ethnicity, or language. Then they would say, well, immigrants who did not speak well English, they would be looked down upon. People were looked at it by agents of the ministry by pronouncing the citizenship oath, and they were looked at whether they would actually pronounce this. And obviously this was strongly felt by Muslims than by others, because they felt they were not more looked at and actually tested on this. And then we also checked that there were a lot of what we call management-related boundaries. And this is the ones when migrants said, or new citizens told us, my file got lost. I couldn't communicate to anyone. It was just such a backlog. So these would, in their parlor, was just something that happened with no particular function. It was something that also everyone was submitted to indiscriminately. And it's really something that they felt was purely administrative, and we, looked at them separately, but obviously those who with human capital were able to easily overcome those hurdles as well. Okay, in this paper, and then I'm going to come more to the part that I hope I'm still with time, but that I really want to kind of highlight more. In this, and here you have just maybe one you have these kind of what I just said, the summary of the and some examples of the human capital boundaries, which were blurred, so not they were present, but they were easily for our interviewees to overcome. In this paper, taking Canada as a widely envied and imitated example of liberal and difference-blind economic immigration, I examined the permeability and constraints and symbolic meaning of the different requirements of the naturalization process from the perspective really of those who have undergone this process. My study reveals that the 3 steps of the application process, as I mentioned, filing the application, studying the citizenship guide, and then also sitting the test, attending the ceremony and swearing the citizenship oath, constitute mostly blurred boundaries for skilled and highly educated immigrants, with occasional boundaries related to management flaws, class naturalization, and cultural biases. Specifically, my study shows that citizenship candidates are indirectly tested for attributes associated with upper middle class status, such as talent, creativeness, self-sufficiencies, and entrepreneurship. Holding valued human capital is the most important factor for successful naturalization. It enables not only the passing of the citizenship requirements, but also allows for dealing with numerous administrative errors and oversights, those management boundaries. Canada's naturalization regime operates thus as a second levels of social closure along exactly the same economic logic that governs immigrant selection through the point system. Even though the new Canadians interviewed for this study were part of a cohort that was subjected to particularly rigorous edition of the citizenship knowledge and language test that was in place in 2010 and 13, so it's a while back, under the Harper government, they did not experience any of the unusual difficulties in fulfilling the requirements. By and large, the description of Canadian naturalization process fall within what has been termed liberal citizenship policy, like by Yopke and Sarah Wells Goodman. They felt that, and I quote, Canada treats everybody the same, quote, end quote, and that the naturalization process is, I quote, fair and absolutely necessary if you want people to be able to integrate, end quote. The enforcement of civic liberal integration, however, produces counterproductive effects when citizenship candidates feel intimidated to an extent that they say just things that they do not understand in order to avoid punishment to fit in. For example, it was noted that the pressure put on candidates to well pronounce the oath was so intense that it caused counterproductive effects, as I just said. And here's the beginning of a quote for one of our interviewees. Everyone that I could see there said the oath in both languages, English and French, even though they didn't speak French. They were so intent on saying it that they said it in language that they didn't understand. Here, obviously, the performative element of the citizenship oath is nil if people say what they don't even understand. My findings align with international studies stipulating affinities between neoliberal and communitarian definitions of citizenship. I'm thinking here of the work by Schinkel and Van Hout, for example. However, while the tendency is the same, there seems to be a difference in degree. The highly skilled new Canadians interviewed for this study did not feel overly coerced and reprimanded, as studies, for example, have found in the US and also in the UK, either because they were able to make creative use of their abilities during the application process, or comparatively speaking, Canadian citizenship remains a beacon of good and peaceful life, as often shown by Sofia Attica and Irene Blumgard. So when this is happening, what are the questions that this kind of study raises? And I would like to, in the rest of my talk, underline 5 points, which I put here And I put them on the same slide because I'm unable to talk and change slides at the same time. I usually tend to forget. So here you have the 5 points already in point form. So first, my findings align very strongly with scholarship highlighting the attribution of citizenship as an earned privilege on the basis of citizenship candidates' successful demonstration of individual human capital. Other scholars have shown this abundantly for other countries, like Van Hout, but also Costacopoulou and Antje Elleman for Canada. Respondents were specifically confident about obtaining Canadian citizenship because they could rely on their upper middle class education or professional training to pass requirements, and this regardless of their cultural background. I quote, "I took a lot of exams in China, so I'm good at it," end quote. Respondents were highly aware of their privileged class position, embracing the logic of market fundamentalism and neoliberalism suited their situation and application, almost allowing them to feel entitled to Canadian citizenship. When someone said, "Well, I'm qualified, right? So I will get it." This confidence was slightly, but not substantially stronger when the file combined human capital assets, such as excellent language skills, university education, and financial self-sufficiency in combination with cultural and long-term kind of nation-building considerations, for example, being of Western culture, contributing to population growth, as one interviewer put it. I quote, "My application is a no-brainer. I'm an English-speaking, master's-educated American who's employed and has children here," end quote. Taken together, the skills and psychological attributes required for naturalization are very much the same than those at stake in the selection of economic immigrants through the point system. In the naturalization process, these economic criteria are then also applied to individuals who join Canada as permanent residents through non-economic streams such as family reunification and political asylum. And this is something that Antje Elleman has also underlined. Second, in contrast with the point system, which operates at an early level of social closure and stipulates that these criteria formally and transparently, right? You have the website and you can actually go and click and see whether you get those points. The naturalization process tests, quotation, human capital skills informally at an applied level and after individuals have already been accepted into the country as permanent residents. While this kind of testing did not pose a major challenge to the highly educated respondents in this study, many expressed concern about the fact that such criteria, which seemed appropriate for evaluating economic immigrants like themselves, were also applied to individuals who had been granted permanent residency on a very different rationale. As one of my respondents put it, "The naturalization process," and I quote, "can probably cause difficulties for some people. You know, I mean, if you come here as a skilled worker versus the refugees, then you come for different reasons," end quote. To them, the language and knowledge test seemed, I quote, "too hard for many immigrants who are nevertheless good Canadian citizens," end quote. Interestingly, discourses of distinction, meaning respondents drawing lines of distinction between themselves and, in quote, undeserving others, in order to portray themselves as more commendable, were less prominent than discourses of compassion. While this attitude contrasts with finding from the citizenship process in the United Kingdom, as Bassel and Montfort and colleague have shown, it corresponds to the citizen negotiator, also a study by Bassel and colleagues, and also the dominant figure of caring Canadians in national self-representation. In future studies, we want to probe if and to what extent these statements are uniquely the consequence of social desirability effects, meaning new citizens feeling obliged to demonstrate how Canadian they have become by producing dominant narratives of national identity, or whether indeed naturalized citizens, many of whom come from less liberal societies, promote the kind of compassionate citizenship that native-born Canadians like to take credit for. To a certain extent, the question is, are naturalized citizens the better multicultural Canadian citizens? Third, the fact that only a few bright cultural boundaries were identified, and in the paper I give examples of them. The lip serving, observing was one of them. Mostly the other ones related very strongly to objections to representations in the citizenship study guide. So, but there were fairly few that were outlined, and people were really complaining about, let's say, racist boundaries or cultural oppression and stigmatization. So this kind of fact was striking, because almost half of the respondents were members of racialized groups. So this seems to contradict then the claim that the neoliberalism as a post-Fordist regime of acculturation necessarily involves a regime of acculturation. Many of the respondents were enthusiastic about Canada's ability to, I quote, accept such amazing diversity, end quote, and to belong, I quote, a multicultural society, very, very diversity, end quote. However, they also noted cultural biases such as Eurocentric chauvinism at work in the insistence of gender equality in the citizenship study guide, and the slippery slope between fitting in at the level of language and fitting in as a white person, I quote. I think it's probably different for me because I fit in like language and so on. I'm not a racialized minority of anything. So I could pretend that this was my history and get away with it, end quote. Notably, the higher educated immigrants interviewed for this study naturalized relatively fast and easily, even if they were members of racial, ethnic, or religious minorities. The perceived absence of cultural boundaries speaks to the strengths of multiculturalism as a national identity and ethos of social integration. Indeed, with the parameters of this study, the culturalization of citizenship, while not absent, is not as starkly felt or represented as has been shown for European countries. As such, the findings of this study suggest that multicultural citizenship, and as a shorthand for membership in the self-proclaimed multicultural nation, becomes available first and foremost, and definitely most easily, to the highly skilled. Indeed, it has been argued that it is only possible to have multiculturalism in Canada because of the immigration system. And then the question obviously is at stake whether we need multicultural citizenship, but that's something for the debate. This then raises the question as to what kind of multicultural citizenship is promoted through Canada's naturalization regime. While a nuanced answer to this question is beyond the scope of this paper, allow me some pointers. Kimlicke's multicultural citizenship that he derives from the Canadian model includes self-government rights, the delegation of power to national minorities, often through some form of federalism, polyethnic rights, meaning financial support and legal protection for certain practices associated with particular ethnic or religious groups, and special representation rights, so guaranteed seats for ethnic or national groups within central institutions. None of these were highlighted by my respondents, and while the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, where Canadian multiculturalism is enshrined, used to be distributed at citizen ceremonies, this practice was abandoned under the Harper Conservatives, and it was not reintroduced by the Trudeau Liberals, who are currently in power. None of my respondents received a copy of the Charter. Rather, the logic pursued by Canada's naturalization regime seems to operate somewhere between Christian Job's multiculturalism of the individual and Thomas Faye's diversity as a mode of incorporation, meaning a word of incorporation that is often used in corporate in companies. This form highlights liberal anti-discrimination individual rights, and the latter insists, as I just stated, that individual social and cultural capital are prioritized over the necessity to become ethnoculturally indistinguishable from the social mind stream. Within the scope of this paper here, but I'd like to come back to this in the discussion, I will leave it up to the eye of the beholder to which side the pendulum may be leaning in the Canadian case. Fourth, even in Canada, the attainment of multicultural citizenship at the end of the naturalization process does not come quasi-automatically as the same right for everyone after years of lawful residency. Rather, as I now underlined a couple of times, citizenship in the multicultural nation is granted as an earned privilege to those who demonstrate a successful mastery of the skills and mindset of middle-class professionals. In this respect, too, the tendency seems to be the same in Canada than international. As such, The logics driving Canadian immigration and naturalization can be characterized as ethnically, racially heterogeneous middle-class nation building, where the intake of valued human capital trumps explicitly was Eurocentric national identity maintenance. Indeed, immigrants selected through the point system are overwhelmingly middle-class men. In fact, that these individuals are often offered fast and easy naturalization, as exemplified by the respondents of the study, underscores the long-term demographic dimensions of Canada's nation-building project, at least with regards to this kind of human capital. And if we take to this Justin Trudeau's recent kind of underlining that Canada wants to increase, have more immigration, we can see what is at stake here. I quote, "We are a country that is open to immigration," Trudeau argues, "being able to get the top talent and draw on big pools of well-educated, ambitious, forward-thinking and diverse people is a hell of a competitive advantage that I don't see, for example, the US matching anytime soon." Here you have immigration as a competitive force to nation building. Fifth, and in stark contrast, these immigrants, so the highly skilled that get accepted, their spouses, often the women, as well as individuals admitted through non-economic streams such as family reunification and refugee resettlement, are either delaying to become citizens or struggling to pass the language and knowledge requirements for naturalization. And this is what we examine in the paper with my colleague Devin Nakash. Indeed, this research reveals that where difficulties for citizenship candidates with lower education level are likely to occur, the large amount of online documentation to be handled for the application process, the filing of forms without the ability to request personalized help from an agent, the necessity to engage with bureaucracy in countries of birth and of former residents to obtain official documents, a task that is even more difficult for refugees, and the high level of literacy and language proficiency in English or French required for the process and for apprehending the information in the study guide. The direct and indirect costs of the application process, for example, you just not have to pay the fees, but you also have to take maybe time off in order to sit any of the tests or to come to the ceremony. And the inflexibility of work schedules in many low-paying positions, rendering appointments with government agencies difficult and costly. The many obstacles and delays due to management flaws or human errors cited by my respondents also caused unnecessary additional and probably also unhelpful and unwanted strain, while they also affected the highly skilled respondents in the study and were all the more frustrating for them because they're often used to some preferential treatment. These individuals were able to resort to social and cultural and professional skills to circumvent some of the negative effects. For example, some of them argued, well, I A-tipped my file, meaning that they resort to access to information, procedures that are usually used by professors, researchers, and journalists. Others contacted their MP. More research is necessary to find out who is delaying, failing, or abandoning their citizenship application and why. Knowing more about these permanent residents and their challenges, as well as ultimately facilitating their naturalization, is, in my view, crucial to avoiding a two-tiered citizenship status system within Canadian society. Without equal civic and political rights, a just and democratic society is not possible. Research also shows abundantly that holding citizenship correlates with higher earnings, such as a study by Pentacore and Bevelander. In a just society, the benefits of citizenship must be distributed equally across all members of society, including the less educated, who crucially enable highly skilled professionals to function by providing contributions in lower paying jobs, as well as unpaid labor in the third sector and in the public realm. This, I think, the COVID-19 crisis has abundantly shown. Thank you. Sorry, I needed to stop share, otherwise you can.
Oh, right. I thought I'd unmuted myself, but anyway, I'm unmuted. Thank you very much, Elke. And as you noted yourself, it's very good to have leading Canadian scholars here to join the discussion. So that's a real bonus. So I see Anna Triandafilidou and Jeffrey Wright and no doubt others who I don't recognize just by their names. But anyway, you're very welcome here. Maybe I could kick off by just asking a question. So obviously your concern and your findings are related to creating a two-tier naturalization process and therefore two-tiered citizenship, at least amongst the new citizens. And that could then be a long-term division. But am I right in thinking that Canada, like so many other countries in the world, over the last couple of decades, has had a quite significant change in the composition of migrants, not so much as from where they're coming from and what their ethnicity is and so on, but on their motive. And Canada has been encouraging temporary migration, just as, this is common, of course, in so many other places as well. And that the temporary migrants now are a very significant proportion of all migrants, and they are a temporary economic migrant, so they're selected on the basis of human capital as well. So if that's the case, and I see you nodding, isn't there more like a three-tier system, temporary migrants and those who wish to settle, who come with a view, at least, that they're on a pathway to settlement and citizenship, who are the upper tier, then the ones you described, and then those who are in the lower tier. So yeah, I'd quite like to hear you pick that up.
Yes. Thank you. And I see, Anna, I see your chat, but I haven't been, I can't listen and read at the same time. I saved it, so I hope to get to, or you have to. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. What I think my concern in this is, and others like Jeffrey have worked in this, pounded this out for a long time before me, that how connected multiculturalism and economic migration are. What I think what I find it intriguing is actually that we have, and this paper was based only on immigrants. So we have the two so far, most of the permanent immigrants come in and they are on a pathway to citizenship, where the ones that you noted who come in as temporary migrants, and you're absolutely right, it is about, I think even the numbers are higher than the permanent residents now, the intake. I didn't count them in for the nation building because it is, I counted them more of, I was thinking more about the humanitarian demographic dimension that Canada is also trying to kind of grow as it will never reach the numbers of its 1,000 neighbor, but I think there's a question of growth, population growth that is in there. But I think you are right, and this is maybe with the temporary migrants and the increasing two-step migration, meaning that by now you have people who are allowed in the country, mostly at the low skill end, that is agricultural workers, but also care workers, but also those with skills are coming in and will be giving an access to citizenship, but actually as a second step, meaning you come in on a work permit. International students could be one that they're allowed in on a work permit, and then basically have to show that they are fitting in, making money, have no criminal convictions, and eventually will lead to a path of citizenship. So you're right, there could be a third, it could be a third tier, and that is exactly, I think, the argument by people arguing that that's. Whereas my research, I wanted to show that sometimes skills can trump racialization. So you have, in a way, at the top level, you have, I would argue, and I know this is debatable or disputed, but I think at the top level you have an increasingly multi-ethnic, multi-racial top kind of tier of citizens that are often holding dual citizenship, multiple citizenship, that I'm free to move. And here race or ethnicity does not matter so much. On the other hand, at the very bottom, you still have people who are racialized, although you have then also at one point, as I think most of the studies in US mostly, but on populism have shown that we do have an alienated kind of lower white middle class that sits somewhere there and feels that other people are kind of cutting the line. And then we have often racialized temporary workers, also in the highly skilled, that are similarly struggling, still not feeling that there's glass ceilings, still not kind of having a kind of a real seat at the table. So yes, I think what I felt in terms of multiculturalism and as a policy, and you've, Tarek, you've worked on this, is the ranking is not totally displaced of white people at the top and browner people at the bottom, but I think it's been unsettled, and I'm struggling how we should react and to this as scholars, but also probably at some point in policy and in designing some kind of citizenship policies and multicultural citizenship policies that address this.
It'd be very good to pursue that theme further. Anna has been wanting to come in, so I'll let her come in now, either on that theme or whatever you wanted to raise, Anna. Go ahead. I think Thomas has to unmute you, unfortunately.
Okay. No, I just want to say Thomas had to unmute me. Yeah, thank you very much, Elke. Great to
connect.
Zoom allows us to connect across the distances. I wanna add to kind of also a little bit provocative statements or questions. I mean, it has often occurred to me, and the more I get to know Canada, the more I think about it, that it's a skills citizenship. So if you have the skills, you can come in. And I think generally, I mean, Canadian citizens, I won't say Canadian scholars or Canadian permanent residents, sometimes don't even realize that this is not a usual policy across the world, that somebody can come in as a permanent resident. So you may not have set your foot on Canada. If you apply from abroad, it probably takes you a couple of years and several hoops to jump. But then you come and you have full socioeconomic rights. I mean, I compare the PR status with the status of EU citizen, just quite advanced. But I have had, yes, this feeling that it's a skills citizenship, but of course then the other thing, and I don't know, maybe Jeff Reeds can talk more about it or give us more insights than I have, is that studies have shown that your skills can be fully be beneficial for you in the labor market if you are of European descent. However, having said this, again, some work of Rupa Banerjee and I think Jeff and other colleagues has shown that the educational credential assessment, that is, how can I say, an add-on to the point system that was introduced in 2014, where in order to help, so the idea of the government was to help employers recognize the value of degrees that were not known to them. So from, well, distant citizen universities around the world, you have first to apply to accredited institutions, particularly World Education Services, which is a non-for-profit, very big in North America. And the other, for instance, is the University of Toronto special section on this, where they say your BA, your MA, your PhD is recognized, and they kind of stamp and certify it. And actually, Rupa Banerjee's work has found that this has led to a sharp decrease in applications from China and an increase in applications from India. So that's very interesting how skills do combine, I think, with race and ethnicity. And in Canada, we would perhaps use the term visible minorities, but I think in Europe, we would use the word ethnicity. So the system is ethnicized because it doesn't suffice as my life is easier being white, whatever, European or Caucasian than if I was Indian with exactly the same profile. But then that particular, the education credential assessment creates an interesting, implication. And the second thing, so I wanted to bring to the floor this idea of a skilled citizenship, which has also occurred to me when you think of all the super mobile, highly skilled people around the world, where and these are the people that you meet more, of course, in London or Toronto or some other places than in the smaller cities. And the second thing is, so I think what you're advocating about is a more egalitarian multiculturalism. So we're thinking of a variety of multiculturalism, or how can I say, a further qualification. And likewise, there's been this criticism that multiculturalists can be neoconservative or conservative or, or neoliberal. I think we're saying it's not sufficient, and that is also for Tarek, it's a question for Tarek. So it's not sufficient to say we want multicultural citizenship, we want an egalitarian multicultural citizenship that would apply some further checks and balances on that front. So I just wanted to have your reaction to this.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. Yes, to be fair, I probably have more questions than I do have answers, because would this study in a way prompted me, or it fed into really a kind of questioning about what we're seeing, I would think, worldwide. In Canada is almost, in a way, it is an outlier, but I think it also becomes, or has been a role model, and maybe it becomes one case of many others. If you've seen, I don't have the numbers yet, but I think recent studies, among others by Hein Haas, show that there is this kind of the race for skills, and I think 40% of OECD countries want to open their borders for, and I think Anna, you've done work on this too, it's for highly skilled. So there is, in a way, an increasing race for this. In Canada used to be an outlier, but I think other countries, Europe, but also China, are in a way catching up. And so we see as you mentioned, skilled citizenship. It does, I think, is in a way on the rise, which allows racialized and ethnicized people from the global south finally to catch up. We can say though, although I think they're what Tarek mentioned, they are, as they're catching up, we introduce new hurdles such as the two-step system. It's almost like with young people or women, once we are at the moment where we get positions, then the positions are no longer permanent. It seems to be the same thing that is happening to minority populations right now. So on the one hand, I want to be arguing it's a positive outlook. On the other hand, I think we need to, and I agree that, the China and India, you also have the language element in there. So it is, I think, the point system in itself was never totally right-brained. That even when it was introduced, you had people like Alan Simmons, who I think from the very first time showed that obviously, where do you get the points? Well, it's easier to get good points for education if you're German educated than if you're Afghani educated. So it's never been entirely kind of race blind. So I think this is something that is continuing. And my question is a bit, I'm trying to make sense of the current, Ali Hochschulz calls it the empathy wars, meaning I try to understand what we do with the rise of right-wing oppositions, if it's a backlash against multiculturalism, or is it's where that people perceive migrants increasingly, particularly high skilled, as line cutters, as coming in above them. So I try to bring class into the discussion of multiculturalism, something that, again, it'd be interesting to have Jeff's position on this, because that is something that, at least for me and my scholarship, has escaped me for a long time. And I think that is kind of something that I try to get it with this here. So we're no longer talking about an entirely ethnic kind of underclass that multiculturalism seemed to address, we're more talking of multicultural professionals. At the same time, it is not true that racism does no longer exist, right? I mean, I really don't want to even go close. But I think we kind of have to adjust our categories. And I don't know yet how. I mean, this is really what I'm struggling with.
Yeah. I would like to pursue your challenge, take up your challenge about thinking about its implications for concepts and theories of multiculturalism, but I'll restrain myself. I mean, I will want to raise that, but I want to give other people a chance to raise that or something else if they'd like to. If there's no one bursting to come in now, I'll raise it now, but I'm willing to also wait. Well, no one's bursting. I mean, Jeffrey, I don't know whether you are there, but your name has been invoked and your comments have been invited from you. So I'm very happy to give you the floor if you are still by your screen rather than having a cup of tea in the next room. Okay, well, look, I'll ask the question I wanted to. Yeah, so you said, okay, one of the implications this has for how we think about multiculturalism is that it doesn't look anything like Will Kymlicker's theory of three different group kinds of multiculturalism, you know, indigenous people and a nation like Quebec and what he calls polyethnicity, you know, migration-based multiculturalism. And none of the answers of respondents evoke that for you. Well, fine. Well, I accept that. I understand that. But the next step that you took that I'm not really that happy with. So you said, oh, well, actually, it looks more like Christian Yopka's kind of multiculturalism of individuals or Thomas Feist's incorporation-based diversity, diversity-based incorporation. Well, actually, I think that's a little bit premature because you're bringing in multiculturalism to bear on immigration stroke naturalization selection criteria, and multiculturalism isn't a theory about that at all. Whether it's Will Kymlicker or Charles Taylor or Bhikkhu Parekh, none of them have suggested that multiculturalism is an idea or a political project about choosing which migrants or even crafting an immigration policy. So on the whole, multiculturalists assume that an immigration policy should not discriminate on the grounds of ethnicity, race, religion, perhaps language as well, that category, that register, a range of things. But the positive identity recognition that is at the core of political multiculturalism is, you're quite right, related to the idea of nation building. That's true enough, but it's related to people who are citizens, not a basis for choosing who should be allowed into the country or not allowed into the country, because that would be very different, and in fact would probably look like a discriminatory policy if someone said, oh, we should have more Indians rather than we should have more IT engineers. So no multiculturalism has any traction with questions about grounds for selecting migrants. It's all about the place that citizens have once they've been made citizens. So the question then is, well, what is it to be a citizen? And that's where multiculturalism kicks off, in answering the question, what it is to be a citizen in a polity like Canada, not like who are we granting nationality to. So yeah, that's why I think you're using Yobka to characterize the pool of newly naturalized people as if that's an example of a kind of a rising theory of multiculturalism. Yeah, I think that's a misstep.
Okay. I think we're on the same line fully. Now, what I obviously, I mean, in the paper I say this is I use the word or the concept multicultural citizenship not to refer to Will's concept in particular, but rather to kind of describe the kind of citizenship that is accessed by those who are. So it is not about choosing, but it is about the kind of citizenship that immigrants who become Canadian citizens are invited to. And here I feel if we have a system that highly values individual kind of cultural and human capital, then we are closer to Jacques' kind of human rights multiculturalism of the individual than we are actually of any kind of group-based, more group-based. Even Will's is liberal, so it's not in a way group-based, but it's pseudo group-based. And I think I'm closer to your concept of multiculturalism, that we need to bring the groups back, that we are. Otherwise, they are invited into, a society of individuals, and you can thrive. I would say, despite racialization, if you have you just have to kind of make up for your cultural or racial flaws. And flaws, please, I mean, get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. It's what I mean. It's in quotation marks. By having more skills, you just have to be much better if you're not of European descent. So, and then you can make it to a certain extent. But that means we're rewarding individuals, and we are inviting individual kind of skills capital. We have forgotten about multiculturalism that was used to be associated with social justice, with the idea of that individuals are not just liberal individuals happily kind of thriving on their own, but they're actually situated within a culture. And that's what I wanted to say when we have a system where, let's say, the primary applicants for Canadian citizenship are men, and they get admitted because they do have the skills, but their wives take much longer to become citizens because they maybe don't have the education, maybe they don't have the time to study as hard for the test, or maybe they work in professions that are, they come with them, but they're not they are permanent residents. They're admitted on their, let's say, husband's credentials into the country, but then they take so much longer to become citizens. But these are the women, or these are the people who support our highly skilled. They all kind of think someone has to do the laundry, someone have to raise the kids. So we need to go back to maybe think about more of groups and social justice. And that's, I think, the idea the direction where I wanted to go next, and see how do we bring this kind of redistribution and group-based approaches back into a citizenship in Canada.
That's music to my ears, so that's good. But I'd like to separate out the individuals that are selected on the basis of, say, human capital or national economic priority criteria, groups as part of the polity or part of the citizenry, and then questions about social justice. Separate out those three things for a moment, because those individuals who are selected on the basis of their human capital doesn't mean that they're just going to be isolated individuals. In fact, they will join perhaps a number of different kinds of groups and communities, and some of them will be professional associations, obviously, and middle-class suburbs and so on. But they'll also be interested, some of them, most of them, in issues around cultural identity, and especially when they have children and think about how to transmit a certain identity to their children and so on. So in Britain, over the last, I don't know exactly what period, but let's say, I don't know, something like 15 years or so, we've seen a very significant rise in the number of new Indian migrants. And they're all exactly the kind of people that you've been describing as your upper tier. They are selected because they have skills the country wants, they bring in money, they are internal movies within multinational corporations and so on. They're in the City of London, highly qualified bunch of people. But at the same time, we are seeing a growth and consolidation, and not always, I would say, in a way that is very multicultural oriented, but we're seeing a growth in Indian cultural associations, Gujarati associations, Gujarati heritage, the building of temples, children being taught something about their parents' religion, their parents' language, and so on. So the fact that you're selecting people on the basis of their personal individualized skills and job prospects doesn't mean they don't have an ethnic identity and that they're not going to be part of a group formation whose own self-esteem as part of the Canadian fabric will depend upon a certain kind of group recognition and possibly institutional accommodation. If they want, let us say, issues around burial and cremation to be altered so that you can have funeral pyres for, certain kinds of Hindus and so on. I mean, so many of the issues that we think about as multiculturalist issues, they will arise. So that was the second part, the group part. The third part, social justice, I agree that is a bit different, because in a way we've got a model that the multicultural citizens are a disadvantaged group of people by a number of measures. So they're culturally disadvantaged, racially stigmatized, but they're also economically disadvantaged. And when that breaks, when you don't have consistency along those lines, and you begin to have an economically advantaged group of people, as Indian and Chinese diasporas now in the West are commonly so, I agree that then creates a tension with the view of multiculturalism as a project of social justice. So I agree with that third part, that needs reconfiguring, but not the fact that just because people are selected as individuals, the whole idea of ethnocultural groups goes up in smoke.
Yeah, no, I think, oh, Anna?
No, I just wanted to say that I mean, while multiculturalism is not about who to select, it's I suppose the idea is once we're in, how do we multiculturalize? But you cannot be completely oblivious of, because likewise multiculturalism is not oblivious of, for instance, post-colonial pathways. So there are differences between, say, if we take the example of Britain, where there are differences between, say, people that originate from South Asia compared to, I don't know, people who originate from, say, Algeria. And similarly for Italy, it's different. So we cannot be oblivious of how the people got to be there. And somehow it's interesting that this is also legitimized a narrative. And I don't know if Elke, this is something you also had in mind, that the legitimizing narrative in Canada is very economically, colored. But once you're here, then of course you are a full member.
Yes, and I think I'm somewhere between those. I mean, I would say, and again, it would be great if Jeff was there and could join. I think the argument was, to a certain extent, since Canada was selecting immigrants on an economically advantageous basis that you never needed to or that never confronted the same difficulties, and if you have migrants coming in, refugees that need much more on a on a socioeconomic basis. But also we've also known that people who are, even if they have a cultural identity, a certain liberalism comes often or is tied let's say, selective affinities in a way with social high upper class. And so in that sense, you had it was in a way easy. And I agree with to integrate immigrants and welcome them in a multicultural country. If after all, the only thing you had to give them was some kind of anti-racism and recognition, but not so much any form of direct redistribution, even though the two should work together. I agree with you, Tarek, that they come in and have some kind of cultural identity. I wouldn't deny that. But I think, and you mentioned it too, there has been a shift, and I think we're now seeing two types. We're seeing, on the one hand, much more already upper middle class and upper middle class migrants coming in from the global south, who rightly so protest against the glass ceilings that are still in Western societies. And I think you mentioned the Indian associations. I think we can put the Black Lives Matter movement to a certain extent there too. And I think it joins two types of populations here. One's the middle class migrants coming in from the global south, who are not like I just name Allah and me, when able to get into professions that they're actually that are adequate to their skill set and qualifications. At the same time, the coming of age of the second or third generations, mostly second generation, that are Canadians, but also racialized groups or people of color, who then too feel at the one point that they're not getting to that positions. And so I agree with you that they're the groups, but I wonder, and I mean, we've seen the protests, we've seen this in Canada. It's not as stark as I don't know, the UK, but in the US. But I think there is something that we need to adapt the kind of policies we have. I don't know whether we can just make them stronger and say they haven't been working well enough, we just need to reinforce them, or how do we adapt them and also legitimize them in countries where at the same time then we have this development, have a rising social inequality that actually touches all parts of the population, not just racialized people, but also white settlers or members of the dominant majority, who have increasingly become, at least in part, hostile towards these problems. Hostile towards any kind of multicultural accommodation, and that's where my concern sits. Where I see, well, how do we call this? Can it still be multicultural citizenship? Should we? Where do we bring the class or redistribution element in? Again, this is, as I said, I have at that point more questions than I have answers. But this, I think, was the kind of questions that the paper inspired with me, actually, that I saw, okay, good, we can agree, we managed to, some people at least who have the skills can come in easily, but then what then? And is that, two types of reactions. Once we are living in the society together, they're not able to access the status and positions that they actually correspond to their skill sets. So I think the quests and the sense of entitlement are actually higher than maybe with other migrants. And at the same time, we have a stronger backlash in populations that feel that these people, in quotation marks, are cutting in and cutting off. Which again, I don't say it's what is happening, but I think that's the perception. And as we know, perceptions force us to address them too.
Yes, Hans, you want to ask a question? Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, even, at least from my point of view, it's good evening to all my colleagues, Tariq, Anna, others, and especially, of course, Elke. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm a bit puzzled about what I consider to be a kind of a dilemma, because on the one hand, Elke, you talk about social justice, and a number of issues that are related to social justice. On the other hand, I hear you making a plea for group-based identities and for cultural identities. I think that is kind of a contradiction here, because if we talk about the basic institutions of society, I suppose that also holds true for Canada. If we talk about the basic institutions of society, like education, like healthcare, like the labor market, and I could add a number of them, a number of other institutions, the very fact of when group-based identities or cultural identities do play a role in these basic institutions of society, it is a violation of justice. Because if considerations of ethnicity or cultural identity do play a role in the basic institutions of society, there's just one name for it, and that's called discrimination. So the role of these kinds of identities, group-based identities and cultural identities, if you allow them to play a role in the basic institutions of society, you argue in favor of, to put it very sharply, but so just to provoke a bit and to tantalize you a bit. I mean, attributing a role for cultural identities and group-based identities in the basic institutions of society is a plea for discrimination, so for injustice. I'm very curious to know your comments on this.
Yes, you can say that this is happening, but at the same time, you can also argue it is a plea for affirmative action and group rights recognition and or positive discrimination. So that would be the discrimination. Yes, but maybe that is something that that is the whole time. This is the whole question about universal, strictly liberal citizenship, or you have more particularist versions of that, and where you allow quota and kind of ways of recognition for the or previously oppressed groups, which I think is at the core of what just not strictly liberal multiculturalism wants to do.
Yeah.
Anyway, I would say this still is a confirmation of discrimination. So the justice is about getting rid of all kinds of discrimination, whether positive or negative, I would say.
So, I mean, Hans and I have had this kind of discussion before, and I think some of the vocabulary you just used, Elke, and the examples that you use, they're not necessary. Let's put it that way. So quotas, for instance. So multiculturalists are not against quotas. They're not for quotas in the sense that they insist that quotas is the right way to do things. I mean, quotas are a tool. The important thing is the goal, and then we work out in this context how we're going to get to that goal. And some people do argue that, yes, look, we've tried everything else, now we need to try quotas because nothing else is working. And that's an argument we're familiar with. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that multiculturalism requires quotas or even positive discrimination. But let me give you a very current example. I mean, in Britain, October is called Black History Month. And at the moment, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, in a way, it wasn't confined to 1 month, but that 1 month it was particularly kind of focused and intense. Now, one of the arguments of its advocates, and that includes me, is that it is raising something important that is missing from school curricula, from universities curricula, from public discourses and so on. We need to know more about for instance, we were talking before about the colonial histories. How have we come together as the British people that we are today? Well, obviously, the history of slavery and empire is part of that story. And so perhaps, you know, a part of the story that's difficult for some people to think about, so they'd rather not think about it. But actually, no, to be a proper country, we need to face up to that past together, not just Black people alone, together as a country. So that's a kind of multiculturalist initiative that requires positive recognition of a group identity, its social location, its historical legacy, and so on, and its belonging to the country as a whole. I mean, that's the claims that's being made. And there's no quotas or anything like that. I mean, it's just an argument about what are the things as a country we should be talking, thinking about, and teaching our children.
Yeah, I agree. I think Canada has, that was the famous definition by Raymond Breton, the symbolic allocation of resources, a culture, right? That is, yes, I totally, and we have Black History Month is February in Canada. I wonder whether people from the Black Lives Matter and the BIPOC movement would agree that this is enough. I hear my colleagues and my students, and I'm not sure that they would agree that this is doing the trick any longer. So that's a question. I think that is something, but that is, and this is, I think, the situation for us. I mean, as an academic, I don't want us to engage in activism here, but I think this is the situation that we're facing, that we're having at the one and a movement, the developments that are really felt, that they don't belong, and they don't. And I think it is, it's the famous both, right? I don't think it is just recognition. It is material, and it is ideal. It operates, I think, at both levels. And so I would argue that at least in Canada, and Anna, this must be in Toronto even more than in Ottawa, that we have this movement, and I think they do have a point. At the same time, and this is maybe stronger in Europe than it is at this point in Canada, although even we see kind of right-wing movements in Canada too. We have, at least a segment of the population that we're no longer having on board for even the minimal multiculturalist policies anymore. And I think that's where I think that's where the question for me comes in with the quest for social justice, that we somehow need to address both at the same time. And I don't know how, but I think we somehow need to answer both. Otherwise, we have a kind of dualism or disputes over grievances that we're no longer to reconcile. And if someone has a plausible answer for that, at least my understanding of multiculturalism in the Canadian sense, it at this point, I don't think it does the trick to neither, right? It would be seen as too little. It's never been, but at least I think at this point we are in a situation where we have those two movements, very, very kind of clear cut, and these are things, questions that are formulated. The grievances are formulated not in terms of dignity, but also in terms of access to positions and to professions.
Yeah, we're kind of moving towards the end of our time. I take it, Alexandra, that you wanted to ask a question. That's why you've made yourself visible. If that's the case, I'll let you ask a question, and I can see that Anna wanted to say something, and then I'll let Elke answer those questions and throw in any concluding comments that you have, Elke. So Alexandra, did you want to ask?
Well, it wasn't a question as such. It was a little more a reflection on the discussion. I agree with what you were saying, Eric, regarding the differences on multiculturalism and social classes, or high skilled, in this case, immigrants. What I was reflecting when I was listening to all the discussion was that, I mean, Canada is usually an example for as a successful country of enabling multicultural policies. And we usually use it as an important example on these policies. Then, if it's true what Elke is saying, that there is this kind of bias on the integration, on how people can integrate based on your high skills or low, high skills, then there is a bias in saying like, well, if Canada is a successful country for multicultural policies, it might be because their filter is, they have a previous filter for the success that is precisely high-skilled immigrants. That might be based on a prejudice that high-skilled people have better or are willing to accept better the values of the host society, and in exchange they will get some kind of recognition and accommodation and all these policies. So then I was thinking that this might actually play against multiculturalism, because if we make this visible, like, oh well, Canada is successful, but because they are accepting high-skilled immigrants, then we must follow that example and then start accepting high-skilled people, because the only way that a multicultural country can be successful is by accepting people that are willing to accept our values in exchange for these policies. So that was like my reflection to all of this, and I just wanted to hear your reactions. And thank you very much for the.
Okay,
yeah.
Thanks, Alexandra. Anna?
I can add mine very quickly, and yeah, great point, Alexandra. Yeah, no, I just wanted to make this comment or ask the question. Would you say, Elke, that there is perhaps a certain polarization in Canada happening you used the term that I hadn't heard. You said before a symbolic allocation of resources or allocation of symbolic resources, and how that this is increasing. Because, I mean, there is really a lot of recognition at all levels, from school life to the arts and the cultural industry, to, you know, everywhere, to the media, of the there's a celebration and an appreciation. It's not this multicultural celebration, but an appreciation of the diversity. But at the same time, we see that socioeconomically the barriers persist, or they decrease, but not enough. And probably this has to do, however, with general neoliberal trends in the economy. So anyway, a question whether you'd say that there is this polarization. So while, and this is where the Black Lives Matter movement comes in, which to some extent in Canada came as a surprise because of all this symbolic recognition and, you know, enabling in a welfare state that, unlike the United States and more similar to UK and other European countries, is enabling, is trying to make all ships rise and support everyone.
Yeah, I will try to react to both of you, because I think these are great tools. Well, Raymond Buteau said it's the allocation of symbolic resources, multiculturalism, in the sense that it does not, because and I'm to Anna first and then Alexandra to you. So that would be because the program itself doesn't allow for much money, right, to go around. It's not a big. The budget of multicultural policy or program is not very, very high. So it's more the allocation of symbolic resources. And I think Canada, for a long time, I mean, there have always been people at the fringes that were against it. For some it was not enough, for the other it was too much. But I think overall in all the polling, and that speaks to the point that Alexandra you made, was that, you know, Canadians had made their peace. I think the dominant group majority had made its peace with that and found it was a very kind of successful way, because of the representation of immigrants as seen as contributing to the society, rather than being again a burden on the public purse. So, you know, that also helps to sell ethnically diverse immigration to those who are white. But I do think that we've seen now two reactions. And yes, I think it is less pronounced in Canada, but I think we see it. For the one hand, you have people who feel that this is not doing the trick, right? We pretended the whole time that we recognize, and but I think the BLM and BIPOC movement comes out of that, because it is okay, it's fine to be recognized in the public space, but then if you look at the institutions, and particularly the institutions of higher education and so where public institutions, you don't feel recognized because there are not the people that look like you, right? And so I think you have a movement in that, and that is a kind of polarization that we're seeing. Whereas on the other hand, I see this mostly in Quebec, but I do think that it's also in mostly in the Western Province. I don't know so much about Ontario at this point, but that we have a backlash, right? There's these I don't know what they're called, but Canadians of European descent, kind of right-wing movements that are growing, populist movements that are growing stronger, and then both sides they do not seem to be okay with what has been found as the societal consensus so far. So that's what I'm seeing, and the one I think are pointing to recognition, but also positions, and the other one are also pointing, of course, they are against anyone that doesn't look European and white, but it's also, I think, a somewhat similar movement that we've seen in Europe, of not the poor people, but those in fear of falling in the white segment of the population. And I do not want the Canadian model to fail. I think it's a great experiment. I think we've done well so far, but I think we also should be looking elsewhere to kind of see what we need to do better. And it's Alexander, right? Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. This is something, actually, it's a project that is separate from what I'm doing here. But the term, what I introduced in the talk, the kind of, ethnically heterogeneous middle-class nation building, is exactly that I feel that a lot of countries are trying to imitate the Canadian model, that they're trying to bring no longer, I mean, obviously almost avoid refugees and those who migrants that do not fit into the highly skilled theme, in order to get the skilled people in order to help with aging societies. People again get the point and actually feed into the public kind of pay taxes, and so that they actually can replenish the middle class that is shrinking. Now, the whole question that this poses, and I don't even want to go there because it's a big, is obviously, is this somehow ethical? What, if that's the model of European rich Western societies doing this, brain drain is an old term, but I think obviously the question is about ethics, which I haven't really touched upon here.
Right. Well, with those reflections, I think we would all like to thank you, Elke. So let me thank you on behalf of everybody here. And of course, as was said at the start, the paper has been published in Ethnicities. And in fact, I owe Elke an apology, because I said I'd circulate the paper in advance, and I failed to do that. But there is a link to the paper in the chat, and in any case, it's just in a very recent issue of Ethnicities, so it's very easy to find. If you do have a problem, feel free to email me. It was very good to have you all join us. As I said before, this is the last visiting speakers seminar of the Ethnicity Center. I don't know how many of you are actually members of the Ethnicity Center in the sense of being present in Bristol. I don't recognize a lot of names here. Well, obviously Thomas, but otherwise I recognize names of people who are not at Bristol, which is great, because We do have one final meeting, which is just our own kind of internal meeting. We have what we call a brown bag lunch seminar, a postgraduate presentation by Julio, let me get his surname right, Julio Homocia Elgueta, at 1 o'clock next Thursday. And those of you who are on the internal list, I'll send you, or Thomas will send you details shortly. But otherwise, thank you again for everybody joining us. Thank you, Elke. And I hope our paths will cross again soon,
In person.
online, but even better in person. Okay.